The Reformation wasn't a recovery, it was a rewrite. Discover the history they left out.
All right, let's jump right in. We are heading back, way back, to 15th century Florence. We're going to meet a man who basically set the entire city on fire with his words. Girolamo Savonarola. Now, you've probably heard of him. People have called him a saint, a tyrant, a revolutionary, you name it. But the story you probably know best, the one that paints him as the first spark of the Protestant Reformation, well, that might just be the biggest myth of them all. And right there, that's the heart of the issue, isn't it? Savonarola is often held up as this hero of the Protestant Reformation. But there's just one teensy glaring problem with that whole story. He was executed in 1498. That's almost 20 years before Martin Luther even got the ball rolling. So how on earth can you be the hero of a story that hasn't even begun yet? That's the puzzle we're going to piece together today. Okay, so first things first, let's unpack the legend. And it's a really powerful one. It paints Savonarola as this Florentine forerunner. You can almost think of him as the opening act for the Manovite, right? This lone voice crying out in the corrupt wilderness of Renaissance Italy, clearing the path for the big names like Martin Luther. And honestly, it's a story that feels like it was ripped straight from a Hollywood script. You've got the super fiery Dominican friar who stands up to the corrupt Medici family and a decadent pope. He convinces an entire city, think about that, to just toss all their fancy stuff, their art, their books, their mirrors, onto these huge bonfires of the vanities. Why? To create a new holy Jerusalem right there in Florence. But of course, the powers that be, they're not having it. They excommunicate him, they execute him, and in doing so, they turn him into a martyr, a hero whose incredible courage would supposedly go on to inspire Martin Luther himself. I mean, what a story, right? You know, what's truly mind-boggling is just how fast all of this happened. His entire revolution in Florence, from those first explosive sermons to his own execution, it all went down in just 4 years. A meteoric rise, for sure, and an even faster, more brutal fall. And this right here is the big takeaway from that legend, the bottom line. Savonarola was, for all intents and purposes, Protestant version 0.1. His spark was the kindling that would become the inferno Martin Luther was about to unleash all across Europe. It's a fantastic story, a really, really good one. But is it actually true? See, this is where it gets interesting, because when you start to peel back the layers of that legend, the actual historical record, it tells a much, much different and frankly way more fascinating tale. So here's the fundamental clash. The popular story slaps this label on him, proto-Protestant, a rebel against the church. But the historical record, when you actually look at it, shows us a man who was, first and foremost, a Dominican friar. He was a loyal insider, deeply, deeply committed to the very system he was supposedly trying to tear down. So let's do a quick accuracy check on this legend. Did he preach his heart out in Florence and get executed for it? Yep, check. Absolutely true. Were his reforms some kind of blueprint for what John Calvin later did in Geneva? That's a real stretch. That's kind of reading history backwards. But what about the big one? Was he a proto-Protestant? The historical record is crystal clear on this. Nope, not even close. Big red X on that one. Okay, so if he wasn't the first Protestant, who was this guy, really? To find the real man behind the myth, we've got to look at what he actually believed. And this is the stuff the popular story just conveniently leaves out. Savonarola wasn't attacking Catholic beliefs. He was a champion of them. He totally upheld the authority of the Pope. He practiced this deep, personal devotion to the Virgin Mary. He lived and breathed the sacramental life of the Church. You see, his famous feud wasn't with the papacy as an institution. It was with one notoriously corrupt pope, Alexander VI. He wasn't fighting the throne, he was fighting the man sitting on the throne. Huge difference. And look, if you need any more proof, just listen to the man himself. Writing from his prison cell right before his own death, he wrote this: "I believe in the Holy Roman Church, and I submit myself to the Roman Pontiff." I mean, come on, it doesn't get any clearer than that. The man died reaffirming his loyalty to the very church the legend says he wanted to destroy. Okay, so if he was such a loyal Catholic, why all the drama? Why the bonfires? Why the rebellion? Well, the answer isn't in his theology. It's in the world he was living in. To get it, we really have to understand the Florence of his day. I want you to try and imagine living in Florence in the 1490s, okay? Everyone is absolutely terrified that the world is going to end when the calendar flips to 1500. There's a massive French army that could march on your city at any moment. And the plague, it's this constant, terrifying shadow hanging over everything. That was the world Savonarola was preaching to. It was a city just completely primed for a message of fire, brimstone, and urgent, get right with God now repentance. And that brings us back to the famous Bonfire of the Vanities. The legend frames it as this big attack on religious art, right? A preview of Protestants smashing idols. But the reality was totally different. Think of it more like an intense, citywide revival meeting. The targets weren't sacred images. They were symbols of worldly vanity. We're talking makeup, fancy clothes, secular books. This was not a theological revolt. It was a whole city trying to get right with God fast. So now you can really see how this simple story gets built, right? That proto-Protestant label. It's just a historical mismatch. It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, putting a 16th century idea onto a 15th century man. The whole hero versus church narrative, it just wipes away the incredibly messy and complex reality of Florentine politics. And his execution, it wasn't really about heresy. It was the final, brutal move in a high-stakes political game that, in the end, he lost. So when you put all the pieces back together, the real picture becomes crystal clear. Savonarola wasn't some kind of failed Protestant. He was a passionate, all-in Catholic reformer who was desperately trying to purify his church from the inside. He was a product of his unique, chaotic, and turbulent time, not a preview of a future he never could have possibly imagined. So what's the big takeaway here? I think it's this. When we peel back a simple, easy label like proto-Protestant, we don't actually lose a hero. We find something way better, a complex, fascinating, and real human being. And it's a great reminder to ask ourselves, how many other stories from our past would completely change if we just took a second to look beyond the label?